deployed 2 warships today near a disputed shoal in the South China Sea, the same location where 2 Chinese Navy and Coast Guard ships collided 2 days ago while trying to drive away a smaller Philippine ship. Both China and the Philippines claim Scarborough Shoal and other outcroppings in the South China Sea. The 2 U.S. warships were shadowed by a Chinese Navy ship while sailing about 30 nautical miles from the Scarborough Shoal. There were no reports of any incidents. The Navy has staged what it calls freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea for years. That has angered China, and its forces had close run-ins with U.S. warships and aircraft during patrols in international waters and airspace. China's military today said it monitored and drove away a U.S. destroyer that sailed near the disputed Scarborough Shoal. The U.S. Navy called China's statement false. More on China. A Chinese fighter jet intercepted a Philippine aircraft carrying journalists during a patrol flight over the Scarborough Shoal today. A Reuters journalist aboard the Philippine Coast Guard flight watched as the Chinese fighter closed in on the small plane. Officials say at one point the Chinese fighter came within about 200 feet as it maneuvered behind, above, and alongside the plane. The encounter lasted 20 minutes. Radio demands from a Chinese Navy ship spotted below ordered the Philippine plane to leave immediately. And joining us now to discuss the United States deploying 2 warships to the South China Sea is Steve Yates, Senior Fellow for International Security Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Good afternoon, Steve. Thank you very much for your time today. So this comes after 2 Chinese vessels collided, right, when they were trying to drive away a Philippine ship. And this is alarming several Western and Asian countries. They're calling it a dangerous maneuver. So to start off, can you elaborate for us? What are their concerns here? And talk to us about the gravity of the situation.
Well, there are several issues at play. I mean, number one, there's the very gratuitous and exaggerated territorial claims that China has on the South China Sea that encroach upon the territorial waters and the claims of many nations, not just the Philippines. And so there's that, I think, form of pressure, first and foremost. Second, the Chinese have been sending out more and more of these missions, where it's by air or by sea, trying to aggressively intercept or push away other vessels. And I think what we saw with this last incident was the lack of professionalism among their commanders and crew. So this just reminded me of April 1st of 2001, when the pilot Wang Wei crashed into our EP-3 aircraft. The Chinese military might have a lot of personnel, a lot of vessels, but they don't conduct themselves professionally at all times. And that's where the contrast was with the United States doing their freedom of navigation operation. Very professional, without incident, significant show of capability and solidarity with alliances.
But China is actually tailing the U.S. ships, right? What does that mean?
Well, they do that to try to demonstrate that we see you, but part of the reason you do these freedom of navigation operations is to be seen. So it's a little bit of a dance. But what it really demonstrated was that the United States has forward deployed capabilities, that it has a treaty alliance with the Philippines, it stands with our ally, but more than that, it stands with freedom of navigation on the high seas, and that really cuts right down the middle of China's aggressive claims to the 9-dash line, so-called.
Okay, can you talk to us about the legal status of the Scarborough Shoal? Because you mentioned the 9-dash line, right? How does those two conflict?
Well, the Scarborough Shoal was Philippine territory. The Chinese had taken control of it. And so that was actually an act of military aggression. Some would say an act of war. But first and foremost, we have what are widely accepted standards of certain distances from shore that are international waters, and that any nation conducting themselves in a responsible way should have safe passage. That's what our entire trade system depends upon, not just our security alliances. And so the quantity of the world trade going on the ocean surface through this area is quite significant. And so having these kinds of missteps, potential clashes involving military vessels is very destabilizing.
I think relevant to our discussion today is China's use of gray zone tactics as it relates to the South China Sea. And would you mind explaining for us what those tactics involve?
Well, in the international law of the sea that is what a lot of people go by, there is a shorter distance from shore that's your territorial waters that no one without permission should be bringing vessels into. Extending many more miles into the sea would be exclusive economic zones. When you have territories that could be close together, you might have overlapping exclusive economic zones. And so you could end up with situations where one country is sending their military or civilian vessels into another person's exclusive zone without prior communication or the normal coordination. And it's a form of intrusion and pressure. China does this to a fare thee well to Taiwan. It's literally in the hundreds, if not thousands, in the last year or so. And they've increasingly been doing it around the perimeter of the South China Sea, which is the expansive claim of China extending their sovereign territory all the way down to almost Indonesia.
And as you alluded to a number of times, this isn't an isolated event, right? It follows years of water cannon use, ramming. What is the level of concern that you have that China's actions could spark an accidental conflict, for example, or a more serious confrontation?
Well, it's really the lack of responsibility and professionalism first and foremost. And of course, very coincident with that is just the irresponsibility. This is not a good neighborly way of behaving. It is not what a peaceful power does. And if you look at that Chinese military vessel ramming into its own Coast Guard vessel, that wasn't on purpose. That military vessel was going at high speed. It meant to ram into the Philippine vessel. And if that collision had occurred, that's a significant international incident. There could be casualties. It causes a whole lot of questions to come to the fore about potential military engagement, the invocation of the U.S.-Philippine Defense Treaty, a whole host of things. So fundamentally, this is very irresponsible behavior. The Chinese side knows it extremely well, and they are still doing it.
Okay, just one final question. Is there a way to enforce freedom of navigation in international waters, such as the South China Sea, for example, so that China does not engage in this behavior?
It really is collective action. So the U.S. doing its freedom of navigation exercises, and if it also participates either together with or separately alongside other powers. Every once in a while, you'll see a German vessel or a British vessel or others that are doing this. But the more we have allies that are having these freedom of navigation exercises, the safer our commercial sea lines of communication will be. And it will have greater consequences for China's demonstration of irresponsibility. It won't be seen as an isolated China-Philippine or China-U.S. incident. It's one that challenges the entire international system.
All right, Steve, great insight as always. And again, thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Coming up, New York Attorney General Letitia James sues Zell